This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On February the 27th, the Institute hosted a special luncheon on the occasion of the visit of Sir Lawrence Freedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College, London. Sir Lawrence discussed his latest book, Ukraine and the Art of Strategy, a case study of Ukraine's strategic position post-2014.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. It's nice to be back. It's always nice to be in Toronto, even in this weather. So, this is the authors talking about their latest books. Let me explain why I wrote this, because I'm not pretending to, especially knowing that a number of you are part of the local Ukrainian community. I'm not claiming to be an expert on Ukraine. My interest is in strategy. As I mentioned, I've written on strategy, and after I've done that, after that book had been published, the Ukrainian crisis, as we now know it, started with the annexation of Crimea. And I was talking with a graduate student seminar, and my argument was that we should really look at this to see how much we understand strategy. Here's a conflict playing out in front of us. Do we understand how the balance of power, interests, tactical moves that are being made, how is all this likely to work out? So one thing led to another, and I wrote a series of articles on this over 2014-15, then thought it would be a simple idea to turn it into a book, which shows that I'm not as good a strategist as I thought I was, because it wasn't that simple to turn it into a book, because things kept on moving on. But this represents that sort of idea that here's a case study of contemporary conflicts, and we can learn quite a lot about how to act strategically, how it makes sense, as well as I hope about the issue of the Ukrainian war by applying the concepts that have been developed by strategists over the years. I want to just start with a very quick view about strategy. I'm not going to talk a lot because I want to concentrate on the strategic questions raised by the conflict. There's a view of strategy that you have an objective and you work back from the objective, and that objective leads to a series of points from here to there that you then follow. The difficulty with that obviously is it never quite works out like that. Other people have their own interests and power, and they interfere with what you're trying to do. So I think it's normally better to think about acting strategically. And acting strategically is thinking all the time about consequences, about options, about possibilities, but by and large it starts with the problem at hand. And the problem at hand may be quite a defensive problem. Ukraine's strategic options have largely been defensive through this crisis. You can say they don't have a strategy. They're not necessarily trying to push things to a perfect state in the future. They're trying to cope with the situation as they find it at the moment. But it's a strategy that moves from stage to stage, hopefully with some long-term vision in mind, but make the most of the position in which you find yourself. Good strategy improves things over what might have been expected, just looking at the balance of power as strategy tracks. Now, the reason I'm interested in all of this is because it was quite common to hear in 2014 that we were all being outmaneuvered by Putin. This Putin envy. Putin, the first-class strategist, he should be feared and respected by anyone challenging him on foreign policy. This was not an uncommon view, and it was a view that was reflected in terms not only of what had been going on in Ukraine, but what had gone on in 2013 with Syria, And then gathered pace, and you still hear it a lot, that Putin has outfoxed and outwitted the West all the way through. And I was sceptical of that from the start and remain so. I don't want to suggest the opposite, that he's a complete fool, but I don't think he's a first-class strategist. When people talk about Russians as being the chess players rather than the poker players, one thing about Putin is he's into judo. Judo's his thing, which is quite impulsive and quick and short-term. I don't think he necessarily is a long-term thinker in terms of how things might work out. Anyway, to address the question of how good a strategist he really is, I put in 3 questions for those of you who know the story of Ukraine. These are pretty obvious questions, but I'll briefly explain why they're interesting. The first is the question of why did Putin put pressure on Yanukovych, the president, in 2013. It's a good question, I think, because Yanukovych was as pro-Russian as you were likely to get in the leadership of Ukraine at that time. Yet, actually, the events that took place followed from the pressure that was put on Yanukovych in the middle of 2013, for reasons I'll come on to in a moment. When, at the end of February 2014, when Yanukovych essentially ran away from the crisis that had been created, why did Putin annex Crimea? There's an obvious answer in terms of acquiring territory that many Russians feel is rightfully theirs, but it essentially meant that Russia lost Ukraine, and the idea of a close relationship with Ukraine was probably lost at that point. And then the third question is, having done that, why not carry on? Why not take more territory? Why then didn't he take those areas in the Donbass, Donetsk, and Luhansk, which remain under separatist Russian-sponsored control, but have not been annexed, and are left? You can't call it a frozen conflict because people are still getting killed. So it's not frozen, but actually the battle lines, if you will, borders, haven't changed very much since September 2015. Sorry, February 2015. So why is that the case? Why hasn't Russia been more aggressive? I mean, been aggressive, why wasn't it more aggressive? Let me start with let me just sort of start with the crisis of 2014 and the problem for. Actually, I'm going to go forward and then come back to that. Let's start with why put pressure on Yanukovych in 2013. So, what was the issue that brought this crisis to a head? Well, the first point was that over the period really since 1999, since the Kosovo crisis, there had been steady Russian disaffection with NATO, a belief that the US and its allies played by their own rules despite putting down rules for everybody else. NATO and EU expansion was seen as being hostile to Russian interests, and this was bound up with the colour revolutions, obviously the Orange Revolution in Ukraine itself in 2004, and the revolution in Georgia. There were others elsewhere, and the concern in Moscow that the protest that erupted when Putin announced that he was going to return to the presidency. These were also seen as part of a pattern which in Russian eyes was presented as being instigating unrest in these countries, right? Getting rid of local democratically elected leaders, as they would see it, and putting in place pro-Western leaders instead. So that was the problem, I think, Putin was trying to solve. A concern that this process of colour revolutions plus expansion would continue into Ukraine, as well as Albania and Moldova, that this process would continue right up to the full borders of Russia. This sense of encirclement and the need to push back. And Putin's view about pushback involved the promotion of an alternative to the EU. I mean, it's important to keep in mind this was the most important expansion at issue in 2013 was not NATO, it was the European Union. And Putin's alternative was a Eurasian Union of his own invention, which probably nobody else apart from him took that seriously. But he was presenting this as binary alternatives. And that's combined with what I'd call a habit of coercion. If you look at Russian behavior in the former Soviet area since the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of 1991, you will see a continual use of the interdependence of the independent republics to try to put pressure on them if they were annoying Russia in some way, if there were trade disputes or whatever. A lot of this was around energy because of the dependence of these countries on Russia for their energy, but it was also access to the Russian market, which was often their main market for obvious historic reasons. So there was a habit of coercion which Putin used constantly in order to put pressure on other countries, though they were now independent and sovereign. So the crisis came up in the middle of 2013. Yanukovych, whose capacity for corruption was really of Olympian standard. I mean, this was a man who organized the country largely to support corruption. And the amount of money that was put away was extraordinary. And that remains one of the biggest impulses behind the Euromaidan revolution. But it came to a head because Yanukovych had been trying to, at the same time, stay in with Putin, who ought to have been very pleased to see him in power because he came from the Russophile wing of Ukrainian politics. But at the same time, Yanukovych was trying to stay in with the European Union because he knew that kept happy the other part of Ukraine, and was preparing to sign an association agreement with the European Union in late 2013. In the middle of 2013, Russia put pressure on the three countries that were likely to sign these association agreements: Albania, Moldova, and Ukraine. Albania caved almost immediately, Moldova didn't. Ukraine caved at the last minute, and that was largely because of economic coercion. I mean, basically, Russia pulled the plug out under the Ukrainian economy, and the economy tanked very dramatically, and Yanukovych in late 2013 agreed that he would no longer sign the association agreement with the EU and would instead join Putin's Eurasian Union. A large loan then came Ukraine's way to get it out of immediate trouble. Energy prices were lowered and the variety of things to show that Russian coercion had worked, except it hadn't, because this led to the popular movement known as Euromaidan, which, despite descriptions of it as being instigated by the US or NATO or Soros or anybody, I think was a genuinely spontaneous popular movement which sustained itself over the late months of 2013 and into 2014, and got more and more violent. The best explanation of why it failed is that Yanukovych was both incompetent as a democrat and as an autocrat. He hadn't been able to get popular legitimacy for what he was doing, but when he turned to repression, he didn't do that very effectively either. And eventually, in late February 2014, he ran away, which was the crisis that was created for Putin, because he banked everything on Yanukovych responding to coercion as he hoped he would. We go back to the previous slide. So what then are the Russian options in faced with this? What are the sort of things that what might be their objectives? Well, the first and obvious one would have been to get Yanukovych back to power. And although the Russians said all the right things about legitimate governments and so on, they clearly have very little regard for Yanukovych as a person, as a political operator. So he's still around, but he never became, I think this is significant in terms of the strategy of what happened, he never became a focal point for opposition to the new government in Kiev. So that never seemed that possible. To gain leverage over events in Kiev, that was, in a sense, the obvious thing to do, but that required a political movement capable of doing that. With Yanukovych and many of his cronies having run away and his party disintegrating, that didn't seem so easy. The next possibilities all revolve around making Ukraine suffer for rebuffing Russia, causing chaos, so that it had to wouldn't be able to function, potentially causing fragmentation, so that East Ukraine might split away, or annexing Crimea. And I thought annexing Crimea as the last of these, because that was all that had obvious consequences for all the other potential objectives, because once you've lost Crimea, then it's highly likely you're going to have the political clout within Ukraine to be able to get a majority in the parliament, because Crimea was a big chunk of the Russophile population and was going to create a political crisis with the West, as well as alienate the Ukrainians. Now it is probably the case that if there had been a legal process at work, many Ukrainians, possibly a majority, would have voted to join Russia. Many Crimeans. Possibly the case, but it wasn't done legally or legitimately. They found basically dragooned the Crimean Parliament into proposing a referendum. The referendum took place very quickly. The rules were dodgy. Groups like the Tatars were very upset, and it was all done in a great rush. And I'll come back in a moment to the way it was done. So Putin decided very quickly to annex Crimea. There wasn't a lot of reflection or deliberation behind all of this. They'd clearly been thinking about it during the later stages of the Euromaidan uprising. Reports have been circulating on this. Clearly, it wasn't that difficult to do. There had been plans around, but Putin's decision, which was taken just as the Sochi Winter Olympics were finishing, which is politically is a great moment of Russian prestige, that almost impulsive to get this done. So this is just quickly the timetable, and it gives you some idea of what happened. So the day after Yanukovych fled, Putin decided to occupy Crimea. It was that quick. And the approximate reason, which I think there are other reasons which may be involved, including the naval base. The approximate reason was the repealing the language law which had been seen in the past to give undue priority to the Russian language within Ukraine. And for nationalist Ukrainians, it was something that was objectionable. The point was, by the 1st of March, the acting president of Ukraine vetoed the repeal of the language law. So, although if you look at statements by Putin and Lavrov and others, and foreign minister, that stress all the time the importance of the language law, if they waited not very many days, they wouldn't have had that as a reason, a pretext. But by the time it had been vetoed, the government institutions in Crimea had been taken over, and then followed by the referendum and annexation. And this is what Lavrov said. Reinforced my point, would it be acceptable for Russia, considering its international standing, to keep mum and recognise the coup in Ukraine, and to leave Russians and Russian speakers in the lurch? So that was the reason given, and the timing sort of suggests that, but it was very impetuous. Instead of, there was no reason why Putin had to act so quickly at that time. Nothing else was going to happen because Ukraine was in quite a bit of chaos. He had other options available, and that's the one he decided to go for. And then we want to my next question, which is, why not annex Donetsk and Luhansk? I won't go through the whole story about how these two parts of the provinces were taken over by separatists, but it's just worth saying a little bit about the strategy that was followed. Sergei Glaziev is a Russian insider who had been responsible essentially for events in trying to get Russia and Ukraine and others into the Eurasian Union. But he was working very closely with the characters in Crimea and then in Donetsk and Luhansk. This is a transcript that the Ukrainians published sometime after of him talking to Glaziev, talking to rebels in eastern Ukraine. And if you read it, what he's saying is that we can't do everything with force. We use the power to support people, not war. And if there are no people, what support there might be? So what he's saying is that the way that Russia can help is by coming in support of a local revolt. He needs local separatists to make it happen. If there are not local separatists, then it's quite hard. And one of the difficulties that the Russians face is that the initial attempts to encourage rebellions against the new government in Kiev were pretty half-hearted. They didn't do very well. What happened in late March and April was that some of those who'd been in Crimea working for the Russians, as Russians, moved into eastern Ukraine and were more effective in taking buildings, setting up an armed revolt. And that was why you got these new republics, statelets, in Donetsk and Luhansk established on very shaky foundations. The problem is, can be seen in this next quote. Strelkov is a chap, nom de guerre, known as the shooter, who was an adventurer, romantic, Tsarist, as opposed to a Bolshevik. But this tells you basically what happened. The characters who were encouraged to revolt in the next assumed that as likely as not they would be annexed, that the Russians would come in after them, and the Russians didn't. And what they hadn't thought of is how to run their little stations. They had no administrative capacity. As inevitable in these situations, it's criminals and adventurers and gangsters who are best able to take advantage. And one of the problems for the Russians from this point on was that they never really had credible figures, again, in leadership positions in these separatist areas. So, the lesson that you can learn from any attempts at insurgency, counterinsurgency, is that you need credible local leadership. And those of you who followed it will know the leadership in these international councils have a pretty regular turnover, and there's a continual tension between the desire of those leading the players to get as close as possible to Russia, and the Russian preference for them to play a role as spoilers in the Ukrainian political system. So the Minsk agreements, the first in September 2014, then February 2015, in both cases the Russians did not require the separation of these provinces from Ukraine. What they required is for them to be integrated back within a much more devolved political system where they would have veto power and stop, for example, Ukraine joining NATO or the EU. So there was a tension which was never resolved, still hasn't been resolved, between the role of these groups as spoilers within the Ukrainian system and their desire to be part of Russia. And there's again another lesson that we can draw from that. The reason that they held on despite military moves by the Ukrainian government, sort of about the terrorist operation in the summer of 2015, was because of direct Russian intervention. It was direct Russian intervention. This wasn't a little green man, this was regular forces in August, late July, August 2014, which pushed back the Ukrainians and helped them consolidate their position. But the problem was that you could allow these characters to stay in power, but only within a pretty limited area, because if you pushed any further, you would have met much more opposition from the Ukrainian people, and it would be much harder to administer. So one of the restraints on the Russians was their ability to push forward, despite their military capability of doing so, without just finding themselves in the position of pretty unwelcome occupiers. Now, one of the features of the conflict was information warfare. I talk about hybrid warfare now. And again, I think we often present this as being a great area of success for the Russians, but I just want to indicate why I'm not sure it was as successful as people think. First, actually, if you're saying that this is a local Ukrainian patriotic initiative, it's pretty difficult then to use regular forces, particularly air power, in order to take it forward. So I think, compared with Syria, where Russia didn't have any inhibitions at all, everybody was clear what the Russian position in Syria was. They were trying to say something else about what they were doing. So I think that actually inhibited their ability to strengthen their position in Ukraine. Secondly, their denials were not plausible, and we've seen this in other situations, such as with the Salisbury in the UK in a year or so ago, almost exactly a year ago now, where everybody knows what's happened, but they insist on denying it. And that means actually that the situation goes on because nobody believes their denial. So the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner MH17 in July 2014, on the day it was obvious what had happened. I mean, there was no mystery about who had shot it down, and even the circumstances in which it had happened. But the attempts to create increasingly ridiculous alternative stories steadily undermined the Russian case. And that is a basic point, that if you're engaged in what you think is clever information warfare, you can't create your narratives out of thin air. You've got to have something that rings true with people to work. And this can be done. There are circumstances where this can be done, but it didn't happen to be these. Let me just, basically what I'm just trying to do is to draw some lessons here from the conflict that might have more general applications. Here's another one about the problems of getting outside powers to get involved. So the initial response of NATO countries, EU countries, was reasonably robust because the annexation of Crimea clearly broke international law. Largely was in the form of economic sanctions. It wasn't in the form of military support to Ukraine. Indeed, if anything, military support that might have been there was held back. The problem is that once something seems to settle down, the urgency goes out. So really there has been not a lot of sustained international effort since 2015 to try to resolve it. It's not clear now, and I'm interested in what those of you who know the situation think, it's not clear now what a further resolution looks like, because the Ukrainians now have learned to cope and work around the loss of Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea, while it's a pain for the Russians, but a manageable pain. It's not crippling. The next point is related to this. When therefore you're in this sort of protracted conflict, the way to survive is through economic performance, is actually being able to cope. And I would say the frustrating aspect of the Ukrainian response was not in their anti-terrorist campaign or in their diplomacy. It was not using the opportunity to push harder on domestic reform and anti-corruption, and that remains a big issue. On the Russian side, the economic, I mean, Russia is still a more corrupt country than Ukraine, and sanctions had their effect magnified by the collapse in the oil price. So I think one can see now the longer term consequences of the crisis hitting the Russian economy and Putin's popularity. It's taken some time. But it's just important to note in these sort of conflicts that it's economics as much as politics that makes the difference. This brings me back then to that opening quote about Putin as a great strategist. It's true that authoritarian countries seem to have a natural advantage in terms of speed and stealth, and they produce and they put us on the back foot. Liberal democracies appear distracted, risk-averse, and often superficial. But it's always important to keep in mind that just because you've taken apparently bold and decisive action, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get a better outcome as a result of that. I always think there's a good word to be said for dithering and muddle, because in the end it means that you've possibly just have to work through and find optimum solutions rather than just doing something that appears very clear. So a slower decision is likely to be tested and explored more thoroughly. Putin should have taken a slower decision on Crimea. That relates to what I would call the fallacy of the decisive first move, the assumption that if you move quickly, everything will fall into place for you very quickly. And it often doesn't happen. You may make the first move, you may disorient the enemy, you may catch them out, but it's rarely the case that they succumb so quickly that you can declare victory. They have irregulars able to sustain a struggle, they have reserves, they have allies who come in to help, and people adapt. So the first move was not that as successful as Putin would have hoped. And lastly, again, it's something follows the argument in favour of dithering and muddle, that sometimes it's sensible to do nothing at all. Sometimes the pressure to do something, whatever that something is, can mean doing something that produces limited results and can even be counterproductive. So the answer to the question about Putin as the great strategist was essentially that he created a situation which hasn't in the long term worked to Russia's advantage. He would have done better to wait. There were things he could have said and done in late 2014 that would, in late February 2014, that would have put a new Ukrainian government on notice as to what Russia might expect. But the way he acted, by acting so quickly, he went for broke and really didn't get it. And the final observation on all limited conflict is you can't always get what you want. Thanks very much indeed.
Professor Freedman, thank you for a fascinating talk. Your new book is one of yours that I haven't read. The last time we met was in Beaver's Bar in the company of my esteemed supervisor, MacDonald.
Yeah.
And that's a few years ago now. I'm very interested in your comments about teaching strategy. I teach both at the Royal Military College and at the Canadian Forces College, and I do comparative research on how we teach professional officers. It seems that many countries teach about strategy rather than thinking strategically. And the people who teach strategy are often people like myself who would lose a chess game in the first 3 minutes. So I wonder if you could comment from your perspective as an academic leader about how best to teach strategy, and which of your many works would you recommend as guidance for teaching strategy?
Well, all of them, obviously, but the book that Eric mentioned, Strategy History, is the best one, I think, because it has a view about strategy and explains where the basic concepts have come from. I think the problem with strategy is that it's essentially a word that's used about everything now, from sort of child rearing to passing a driving test to running a company to fighting a war. And it's lost a lot of its meaning as a result. And the way it's often taught to the military is in a very formulaic way, about ends, ways and means and so on. As if there's a checklist of things you have to do, and at the end, if you've gone through all of that list, you've come out at the end with a great strategy. And it doesn't work like that. I think strategy is often quite intuitive. It's about judgment. It's about appreciating circumstances and situations, seeing what the possibilities are within those situations. And therefore, I think it's best taught, as I've tried to do here, by looking at examples.
and cases and seeing how it's worked out in practice. I think there is a myth of strategy that it's the magic ingredient that every policymaker needs. And if only you had a good strategy, then all the problems that befall you will sort of evaporate because you're cleverer than everybody else now. And it just doesn't work like that. Most people, it's not hard to work out often what somebody's strategy is. Good strategy, it seems to me, is pretty well rooted in the circumstances in which you find yourself. It's empathetic to your allies and opponents, so you understand what matters to them, and you know how to form coalitions. You know how to get support. By and large, if you do that, you'll do better than if you just barge in on the assumption that being bold is going to make everybody fall in line in front of you.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.